I'll begin with an anecdote that follows on what Will commented. When I first came to ODNI as an assistant, basically as a senior intelligence officer, I knew nothing about the declassification system, at least, specifically how to write an email. And I said, I don't know how to do this. And they said, don't worry, your staff will tell you. So I spent 2 years writing emails without the slightest idea of how to classify those emails. And then afterward, the archivist came, how should we archive all your emails? Well, in order to keep within the limit, I'm going to basically provide an overview of how I see the state of declassification based primarily on my experience as chairing the Historical Advisory Committee for the last decade or so. So I will also talk about change over time, which is what we historians do. I'm going to discuss or mention some of what I see as the chief culprits in the problem that we have. But first, I'd like to make some sort of global comments. And to begin with, that the state of declassification is worse than it was a decade ago, and it's getting worse. So you can write that down. That's if these were my students, that this would come back on the exam. Basically, the system is crashing, and it's crashing precipitously. Even before the advent of electronic records, which are going to make a really bad situation exponentially worse. The volume of documents that has been created over the last decades has created huge backlogs, which has essentially destroyed the schedule of review and declassification. Basically, the system was not set up to handle this volume, which would be the case even if there were adequate funding and staff, which there are not. The Obama administration recognized this problem when it established the National Declassification Center, which has been discussed. And the NDC has proved effective in facilitating coordination among the multitude of agencies that normally have equities in any given document, at least any given document that matters. But delays cannot be avoided unless or until, one, declassification documents are standardized, as opposed to just having this chaotic situation among the departments. Reviewers are better trained, or I'd go even farther and saying in some departments trained even a little bit. And more agencies adopt commonsensical policies towards waiving their equities. Ironically and lamentably, the situation has become worse because of the use of the Freedom of Information Act and mandatory declassification review. When I was working in the 1970s on the CIA operation in Guatemala, I used Freedom of Information Act to gain access to documents that otherwise were likely to remain classified, and certainly were classified at that point. Today, the situation is far different. Because of the backlog, researchers file FOIAs and MDRs not only for documents concerning intelligence or other security issues, which are likely to be exempted from normal systematic review, but they also file FOIAs and MDRs for all documents because they expect that they'll never get reviewed or released, or at least while they're working on their dissertations or they're working on this book, or in fact, before they get divorced and remarried again. The 25-year rule is at best notional. At best notional. Indeed, the presidential libraries, and Bob made it, no longer conduct presidential systematic reviews at all. They only review documents if you have filed a FOIA or an MDR request. I actually just learned about this relatively recently. So you're incentivized to overload the system, because in most agencies, the same reviewers who are responsible for FOIAs and MDRs are responsible for systematic reviews. The system implodes. They can't possibly do that. So that even if the FOIA system is reformed, and there have been efforts to do that in MDRs, unless there is increased funding and exponentially increased funding, it's not really going to help much at all. Only after understanding this sort of global issues, I think, then these sort of inherent pathologies, can we point fingers at the different agencies. And here's where my experience with the hack sort of pays off. The State Department historical, and I'm basically going to concentrate on the primary actors who contribute to what's known as the Foreign Relations of the United States series, which most of you know about, which is really sort of the central product of what I do. The principal contributors to FRUS are, of those, the State Department is far and away the most effective and the most efficient. I mean, there's no one even close to it in terms of what it's doing. It does have its challenges, certainly, and Bill's here, and Bill comes to all the meetings, and I wonder how many times he said, what happens to the 1977 telegrams? When are we going to get them? Or any of the P-reels and the problems that they have. And I'm going to just mention P-reels because they're probably not familiar to many of you. How many of you know what a P-reel is?
None of us.
Yeah, so okay. So because it's actually indicative of how crazy the system is and why it's so a problem. It's basically emblematic of so many of the issues. The P-reels had to do with State Department documents that were reproduced somewhat randomly, placed on microfilm, and then the originals were destroyed. I mean, any organization would do something like that, right? So they require an index to find anything. The index is classified in most cases. But reviewing them poses all sorts of technological problems that they have to be printed and then reconverted in others. It's just a disaster. This is the kind of problems that go into reviewing and releasing anything. And this is the State Department, which, as I said, is the best of the group. Another is Department of Energy. I won't go into much detail. They're better than they were, but that's really not saying much because their position was nothing should ever be declassified. But they suffer from Kyle Lott, which adds another layer of review, which takes incredible amount of time. And along with Department of Defense, they have parented this great thing called formerly restricted data. And if anyone can define to me what that is, you should talk to the archivist because no one knows what it is. But the word formerly is actually sort of a misnomer because we still can't get at it because we're trying to figure that out. I'm going to defer to Bob with the CIA. CIA has come up and down, but then I get to reserve my real talk for the Department of Defense. Because the Department of Defense is by far, the major impediment to declassification today. And worse, that no amelioration, let alone solution, seems in sight. I mean, at all. The office in charge of declassification basically is vested with multiple responsibilities, from managing FOIA requests to reviewing FRUS to pre-publication review, and the result is it can perform none of them. Not even close. It's incredibly understaffed, but compounding that problem is that, based on what I can judge, is that it's not only incompetent, but it doesn't care at all about what the issues are. Poorly trained, the staff, see, I told you I wasn't going to mince any words. I mean, and I'm just taking it easy at this thing. They're ignorant of both the classification guidelines and their statutory requirements and responsibilities. And I've seen no evidence that anyone in that office is interested in remedying either of the deficits. Consequently, the reviews that the office does do tend to be both late, tardy, and really shoddy, meaning that they are totally inaccurate. The consequences of this, from my perspective, has been literally to bring the publication of FRUS to a halt, because the Department of Defense, as you know, is now a major player in basically all of American security issues. And it's just incredible. And so I'm back to my initial bleak assessment that things have been bad and they've gotten a lot worse. And because FRUS largely is the foundation for the declassification of the documentary universe, that it's going to be a long, long road ahead in order to address this issue. Thanks a lot.